We have liftoff. Okay, I think we can just dive right in. So, thank you very much for joining me, Claire. You're somebody I wanted to talk to for a while because, well, for a lot of reasons, really. But first of all, to help me understand what's being done on a bigger scale in terms of R&D in the regen ag world and what that means. So, could I just ask you to give us a kind of rundown of who and where you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks ever so much for having me. Clare Hill, I'm Regenerative Agriculture Director for FIA Farms. But right here and now today, I'm sitting on my little farm in Shropshire. We moved here as a family to a small family farm in February. So it's been really interesting to get the kind of perspective of doing another farm on a regen journey from the ground up. So that's quite enjoying that.
And tell me what FIA is.
So we are a consultancy firm, I guess, working with food businesses on better food systems at land and sea. So we cover the aquaculture and wild caught as well. We started off 20 years ago I think, when no one was talking about animal welfare, and our founders were really passionate about that, and they kicked off by working with McDonald's and Tesco's, and quickly realised that actually they had lots more ideas, but it was all new ideas at the time, and realised that they needed a farm to put these ideas into practice. And so that's when they started with the tenancy at the Oxford University owned farm in Whiteham near Oxford, and then that's continued on, and then everything's grown. The farming operations has grown, and the consultancy business has grown, and branched out into data systems, I guess, to support the changes that we want to make. Often data can be is key to that, and so kind of intuitive data systems to support better food systems.
Okay, so it's a commercial farm, but one of the kind of reasons for its existence is research into low impact and regenerative methods. Is that kind of, would that sort of sum it up? And you mentioned two brands there that I think a lot of people, myself included, wouldn't expect to be involved in researching regen ag, which was Tesco and McDonald's. Are you allowed to talk about that, about the work they're doing and why? And can you give me a bit of light on, particularly, I think people would be interested in what McDonald's are doing in the regenerative space.
Yeah, so we McDonald's would have a real interest in regenerative agriculture, particularly because beef is obviously the mainstay. If McDonald's don't have beef on the menu, then that's quite difficult for people. Yeah. And that one of the easiest species, I guess, to transition to regenerative agriculture is cattle. But also tied up with that is because one of the perceived biggest impactors on climate change, I guess, is also beef cattle. And therefore, the whole thing sort of ties up into an interest in regenerative agriculture being part of the solution for a number of different problems, including the overall carbon footprint of the business. They're also, because McDonald's obviously operate in lots of countries in the world, and McDonald's Global, their overarching organization, sits in the US, and of course there's the McDonald's US business as well. And they funny that regen ag is kind of like more, it's in America basically, where you've got like two extremes. You've got the most advanced regenerative agriculture movement, I would say, but you've also got chlorinated chicken. So you've got
the
like
worst,
both
the best and the worst in one country. I've always thought that about the States, interestingly.
So they've got, and so over there, they've involved in a project, McDonald's, with Peter Bick and Carbon Cowboys, and actually looking at a 4-year project to look at regenerative farms and their neighbours. So it's like a neighbour study, and looking at both the animal health, the soil, and the people. Interestingly, a deep dive into the attitudes of the people running both those types of farms, with the idea that then that will help to understand it more and how can we roll it out bigger. So when we saw that McDonald's were doing that in the US, we thought, well, you know, we've got this livestock farm sitting here, and we'd already been talking about going pasture only, and we thought, why don't we see if we can take that the whole hog and see if does AMP grazing, a tool of regenerative agriculture, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Does it work in the UK? At that stage, we didn't even know the answer to that question. So that was our original research question with McDonald's on regenerative beef.
Amazing. And now, of course, you've led me in very well to ask the big question: what is AMP grazing? How does it differ from mob grazing, strip grazing, holistic management? These are all terms I'm aware of, but I really don't understand the differences. Could you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, AMP grazing would be most similar to holistic plan grazing, so the model that comes out of the Savory Institute.
Okay.
But adaptive multi-paddock grazing was coined by Alan Williams in the States, and his I think the key in its method, it's very similar. So it's a high density of animals for a short period of time, followed by a long rest period. But the adaptive and the key word within it is the adaptive nature. The fact that we have to and that we need to plan grazing. So the point about adaptive, because often people think once you write a plan, oh well, that's too restrictive, the weather changes, I can't always stick to it. But the key is that there is a plan, but it's incredibly adaptive, whether that be about the weather, the animals, you want to go on holiday, you sell the farm, whatever that adaptation needs to be on a daily, there's big adaptations on a monthly basis or small ones on a daily basis. But the ultimate point about high density of animals, short period of time, followed by a long rest period. And it's that long rest period that differentiates it from maybe our rotational grazing, where we're maybe focused on utilization. Maybe we're going in at 2.5 kilograms of dry matter a hectare, coming out at 1800, and we're on maybe a 21-day cycle. Because although that system grows more grass than a set stocked, where animals are just turned out in a field and left for weeks, months in the same field, although that rotational grazing does grow more grass, it's not having the kind of magic unlocking of the soil health, the root depth, letting some of those species come that are slower to come to fruition and bringing diversity into our systems through that.
Yeah, I mean, that I must admit, what you've described, for my basic understanding of holistic management, it sounds like that's what you've described. And I think the important thing in there is that feedback loop, is that sort of reacting to, not, as you said, not setting a plan and sticking to it rigidly because that's the plan, but actually kind of knowing how to make changes along the way when things change, which inevitably that they do. And how what have you discovered? You said it started in the States and you were trying to work out the feasibility of it in the UK. How has that worked? Because I would have thought that, well, I mean, the States has a lot of varied kind of steady state systems. I mean, there's huge different amounts of landscapes and ecosystems. So I would imagine that there are places where this does and doesn't work, but I would think that particularly the west of the country in the UK is very suited to this. How's the research going?
Yeah, and good. And actually, I would say the east of the country is even more suited to it because,
oh, really? Okay.
Just because we suffer from drought. Drought is a reality. I mean, not now,
Right.
like this spring, not so much, but
Yeah.
previous, we've had droughty springs. Who'd have thought that in this green and pleasant land that we have? But over in the east, we are, drought is a usual thing now. Now, of course, we're not seeing it like we see it in other parts of the world, but cracks in the ground, dry land. Talking to my dad the other day, he's from North Lincolnshire, and he's like, "Oh, we could really do with some rain. Crops are starting to struggle." Well, that I feel like that's the story every year now. And one of the biggest benefits of this type of grazing is it preventing evaporation and adapting the soil to be able to hold on to more water, and that's like the biggest productivity unlocker in a grass-based system, particularly. And so it turns out that it does work quite well. Often a critique of Alan Savory's model is that it's based very much on the holistic management. It's based very much on a brittle environment.
Yeah, so desert landscapes rather than lush pasture.
Yeah. So key there is the adaptation. We don't need to do it in exactly the same way, but the principles of it work. And I guess what's our key learnings? Firstly, that we outwinter on a farm that everybody told us you'd never outwinter on heavy clay, and we outwintered this winter all our cows and calves. That we grow more grass, that our inputs have gone down, and I say that from a place of being an organic farm, so we didn't have high inputs before, but we've less labour. We don't use the topper now because we used to follow all our grazings with a topper to try and keep on top of weeds. Our weed burden has
Sorry,
declined.
what, Claire? What's a topper?
a mower,
Okay,
a
right.
mower to cut weeds. It's just a bit more it's a bit more brunt. It's yeah, it's a bit
But
more
it cuts everything, surely,
yeah,
or is
yeah,
it
it does. Yeah.
selective? Right, okay.
Yeah, it cuts everything, but we would use it after grazing. So the animals would go in and eat the grass basically, and then we'd
Oh,
follow
and
it
they leave
behind
they leave like
the
thistles and
weeds.
stuff, and then you
Mm,
take all those off. Okay.
yeah.
Sorry, ignorant, but thank
No,
you.
no, 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 no. I get too into it and forget all of these
Forget you're
things.
talking to somebody in the centre of London. Yeah.
So we used to do that, and because we were burning diesel, we're using the tractor. So our tractor hours have come down. We don't use the tractor as much, and generally, it's like a happier place to be. So that's one of been the key learnings. Is this just before it felt like a treadmill? We were on a treadmill, and every
Yeah.
year it was like, oh, it won't rain this much next lambing. Surely it will be better. And it was just this like hope that things would be better next year. And we would adjust plans slightly, but really it was always too much rain, not enough rain. We're kind of blaming all these things that are actually outside of our control.
Yeah.
So let's look at what we can control. And what's come with that is this sense of calm and peace, which has replaced frantic anxiety, I guess. And the best example I have of that is not this spring, but last spring. It was this like weird drought spring, driest, coldest spring on record, and of course all you're reading all over the farming press is people are having to feed out. They haven't got enough grass for the fact that animals are calving and lambing, and it's really stressful. People don't know what to do, and they're burning money having to keep animals fed. And Humphrey, who was working with us on the farm at the time, he said, "Isn't it amazing? Like everybody around us is so stressed, and we're not. We don't have that now. We don't have that anxiety." I was like, "Yeah, that really is. It was great." And we felt a little bit smug, but yes, that's why I guess we try and talk about it as much as we can, because if everyone else
Fair
can
enough.
yeah,
Every right for smugness there.
yeah,
I just want to sort of go back to something you said at the beginning of that, where you're talking about reducing inputs. And I've heard this from some of our suppliers who have, stated that the ultimate aim of that would be to get to a point where the only inputs were sunlight and rainwater. But how feasible is that within a sort of UK, suckler herd? Could you ever foreseeably get to a point where maybe taking a bit of groundwater is the only input that you have?
I think we're nearly there. I mean, from from a land management and feed point of view, yeah. So we just that's a key. That's such a good one. I'd never thought, when someone said it to me the first time, I was like, oh yeah. I think Ben Taylor Davis talks about the three frees, and one of those is sunlight, one of those is water, and one of them soil. And we just don't think about those first and foremost in our farming systems. Crazily, when you realise it, you're like, oh yeah.
Well,
So
it's all that nature's got, right?
yeah, and it does such great stuff and produces in abundance that we just can't mimic as farm systems. No farm system, human intervened system in the world produces as much biomass as areas of the Amazon, for example, that are just left to do their own devices.
Yeah.
And I would say that we're there with the grazing. Our inputs really now are around people's time, electric fencing in order to manage the cells. Cells being the way we manage the animals, in that we move them across the farm like the herds would have roamed, but rather than wolves and things keeping them sort of as together,
electric fences.
it's electric fencing,
which, although not entirely pleasant, are more pleasant than a wolf.
Yes, more pleasant than wolf, and of course, and they're there, and the animals can see them, and they know what they are, so they don't touch them, and they know the system. They love it. You go in the morning, they know they're going to get moved. They're waiting patiently for the next piece of grass, and it's really good. And I've forgotten what the original question or train of thought was.
It was just about inputs. It was about getting inputs low. So if you can achieve this state where the inputs are low, and particularly there is no kind of carbon-based fuel usage on the farm, how do you think it's possible to reach a balance where the sequestration is outstripping the emissions in terms of carbon? I know it's an incredibly contentious issue, the whole kind of carbon and methane issue. And there's something I've never fully understood, and I've asked quite a lot of people this, and I've had varying responses. But to my mind, in my logic, every gram of carbon that comes out of a cow's mouth through enteric fermentation started in the atmosphere, because Plant takes it up, photosynthesis, turns it into carbohydrates. Cow eats carbohydrates. Part of that carbon comes back out as CH4 or CO2. So this is like a closed loop of about 10 years. If you're not burning fossil fuels or you're not adding significant more numbers of cattle into the system, surely that has to be a greenhouse gas loss leader, because any sequestration will be removing carbon from that system. Do you consider that to be correct?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about it being contentious, and also I think still a bit unclear. The fact that nobody people can answer different elements of it. So, for example, what's methane's impact, and how long does that last, and what does it do? But what we just don't know, we don't know how. Well, we do know that, for example, carbon sits in the soil, it gets into the soil in different ways, and then it stays stable in different ways or non-stable. And all of that is affected by so many different things. And so, yeah, there is that your model, yes, potentially it's right. But I think what we sometimes miss is when we just talk about carbon, we think, yeah, it's always going to be difficult to have it as we will, if we get the soil working really well, we will be sequestering. Hopefully we'd sequester more than those animals are emitting, and if we're not using any fossil fuel based input, then that's good. And therefore we have a carbon neutral beef system technically. But what we miss from that is the benefit that grazing cattle have on biodiversity, water holding capacity, and everything else that they have. And so if you take a chicken in a concrete shed bedded on shavings, it might look like it's a lower carbon emitter, but it's a million miles from a cyclical ecosystem that a grazing ruminant is as part of that. So I think I am no carbon expert at all, and so I'm not going to try and answer those questions.
But, okay. But no, I mean, it's obviously from a kind of a layperson view, and obviously from the plant-based movement seems incredibly focused on this one issue of carbon, and I find it very difficult to understand where the argument comes from. And also, like you said, I think there are kind of slightly more important issues, and one of them is soil and biodiversity, and actually just how grazing ruminants as part of an ecosystem can repair. I want to go back to something you said earlier, when I suggested that the west of the country was good for grazing. You said actually what we need to do is put it on the east of the country. From my limited understanding, there is a bit of a kind of east-west divide, and the east of the country is a lot of arable, and the west is more kind of grazing and dairy. Were you suggesting that perhaps we should integrate grazing into arable cycles? Do you think that would be kind of the way forward, so that not just, it's all very well, like you mentioned McDonald's, we're putting the research into beef, but even if they're producing their beef regeneratively, if their grains to make the buns are still being done with industrial monocultures that are trashing the soil, that's only kind of half the battle won. But surely if they integrate the whole lot in a sort of stacked enterprise or closed loop, that would be the way forward. Are you guys researching the links between how to use animals to restore soil health, not just for the soil, but for future crop growth?
So I think there's a few questions wrapped up in that one.
Sorry, that was a big one. I'll let you can go for a while on that one.
That's the first one is it beneficial to have animals in arable systems? Yes, and I don't even think we need to do that research, because you talk to any arable farmer now that's reintegrating stock onto their farm, and they wouldn't go back, I think is the main thing. So even if the hassle of having the animals is there, which is why that stopped in the first place, is because it can be quite challenging. But they're seeing the benefits, particularly in this like combined system. So if you're bringing in cover crops, well, you can destroy the cover crop mechanically after it's done its job, ready for planting the next crop, or you can bring animals in and add further diversity there. So I think that goes without saying that is beneficial, and that that should be a direction of travel for most people in their system. Absolutely. And yeah, so grain system where we are producing grain, then it ultimately, if you're just taking it away every year, even if you're putting some muck back on or some other sort of soil conditioner, it might be putting the fertility back, but it's not really replacing all of the mycorrhizal fungi and everything else that's lost. And of course, using techniques like direct drilling where we're not disturbing the soil is really making a fundamental impact on that. But he also raised another point as part of that, which is food businesses thinking holistically, I think, because like you say, at the moment, there's big focus on beef within McDonald's. That's not to say there's not work going on in other areas, but we see this, I think I would say, across the board, really. It's this shift from silo to holistic thinking, and that goes throughout the whole supply chain is needed, because at the moment, often the conversation is about how are we going to help our farmers become more regenerative? And we're not quite yet, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but we're not quite yet at the point where there's an acceptance to say, yeah, we can help you do the farmers, but what about you guys? How are you going to operate in a more regenerative way? Because if we transition all these farmers to a regenerative system, how will you support that? Because your current business model is probably focused on operating in silos. It will be an efficiency based just-in-time model, and that doesn't necessarily fit with a regenerative mindset. So there's a question there for food businesses about what's your step on regeneration.
Interesting. I want to come back to the big business bit, but just sort of ask you about a little point that you made when you were talking there about the kind of integrated systems. Could you, when you're talking about arable and putting animals into the arable, I think I understand this, but just for anyone listening, could you explain what cover crops are?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So one of the big things I think we've realized that we've been getting wrong is exposed soil. Nature hates exposed soil. Exposed soil evaporates water, it washes away in rainfall, and it emits carbon because it's just open and there's nothing holding on to it. So what is unilaterally agreed, I think, and nobody denies this one, is that the more we can keep soil covered in food production or in any production, the better. And of course, the conventional cereal where we're growing a crop of wheat to make bread out of, for example, we're harvesting that in July, and then we're cultivating that soil to prepare it for the next crop, and it's sitting bare for often months on end, particularly if we're maybe not going to re-sow a crop in it until the following spring.
Right, and it could be six months plus of just bare earth. And actually, one of the farmers who I visited who put this very, very well about cover cropping. He said that when sunlight hitting bare earth is a waste of the most precious resource we have, which is the opportunity for sunlight to capture carbon and put it in the ground. And I thought that was a pretty brilliant statement. Sorry, but yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more. What he said, yep. And then so a cover crop effectively is a crop that once you've harvested your wheat, you then sow a cover crop, which will be made up of a real mixture of different plants, depending on what your farm is doing, but mostly focused around deep roots, fast growth, so that they're capturing as much sunlight as possible, and that they spread out quickly and keep that soil covered. And then what you've got there is almost acts as a soil conditioner, fertility builder, brings a lot of stuff back naturally to the soil, which means your need for pesticides, fertilizers will be less, and everything that for the following crop. Yeah, so it covers the soil.
What sort of plants are they plants that are useful to us that are used for this purpose, or what sort of things? You mentioned fast growing with sorry, I keep closing the window because the train's going past, but you mentioned fast growing plants with deep roots. What kind of things would that be?
Oh, so various types of, we tend to use fodder type crop, so it would be things like radish, sugar beet, and herbs like chicory and things, but they would be ones that are probably the varieties that are selected are those that would often appeal to animals. So often people would plant the cover crop, grow it, and then before they plant the next crop in it, they would use animals to go across and graze it. So it would be things that have deep tap roots, but also the variety element. So a number of different plants, so grasses, forbs, legumes, so from different plant groups rather than singular things. Yeah.
So some nitrogen fixing, some phosphorus, bits and pieces and things like that. So you mentioned before when you were talking about cover crops that there were kind of three ways of getting rid of them. One was mechanical, which I assume is like ploughing it back into the land. Presumably one is chemical, which would mean the use of something like glyphosate. And then the third is is grazing. Well, out of those three, to me, there's a clear winner, which is grazing, which is going to have a benefit of, someone brilliantly said a cow is a lawnmower at the front and a muck spreader at the back with a compost heap in the middle, and it does it very quickly and efficiently, and it spreads it out evenly. But I can imagine the difficulty in this, if you are sort of an East Anglia, cereal grower, is how do you then just become a beef farmer for 6 months of the year? I mean, surely we need a huge fundamental change in some sort of pastoral nomadic infrastructure system where beef farmers are traveling around the country with their herds or something. I don't quite understand how the logistics could work, because I would also imagine that the arable farmer doesn't have either the expertise nor the equipment nor the knowledge to then suddenly say, well, I'm going to finish cattle for 6 months in between my crop rotations. How do you think we could get better at that?
I think it's a business opportunity, and I think there are that have snapped it up and are already doing that. I went to college with someone called Jo, and her husband are doing exactly that with sheep. That's the kind of one of the basis of their businesses of their business. So they've got the kit, they've got the livestock, and they've their own farm, but then they do a lot of grazing on other farms, and they're kind of in Hertfordshire. So there's an opportunity there. There's also an opportunity for share farming, for bringing new entrants in. It's an opportunity if an arable farmer would like to bring livestock to the farm, but they don't want all of those things you're talking about. Then it's an opportunity, because farming's so hard to get into. But of course, a career that brings this connection with the land is actually so important to so many people for our physical, mental health, and everything else. And we've lost that when we've kind of become very urbanized. And so it's something to be thought about as an opportunity. Okay, how can I set this up? I want to bring the livestock, but I don't want the total responsibility. How can I support other people into the industry through that? So there's a number of different models. There's a number of different models of doing it, and they are happening, but more of them. Yeah, we just need more of it.
No, and I can imagine for someone who who does want to get into farming but doesn't have access to their own land, it could be an opportunity to basically provide that service to other people's land.
Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, I'm a big believer that the only way we're going to kind of farm a way out of the current predicament is this sort of idea of stacked enterprise and almost sort of nomadic farming. And I've spoken to the guys at Yeo Valley, for example, who are starting to graze arable in between and move their dairy cows around and have mobile milking parlours and things. And of course, what Tim May's doing at Clare in this sort of similar fashion of rotations and sort of shared enterprise with the farmers. I just want to come back to something you said before, where you were talking about, the difficulty of big businesses getting involved in perhaps the unpredictable nature of regenerative agriculture. What do you see the biggest? So I'm super fascinated. I'm not going to lie. I'm super fascinated about the idea that McDonald's are getting involved in regen ag, particularly because I don't see them talking about it. So it's obviously something that is happening maybe a little bit at corporate level rather than public facing level. But how far away? Well, I'm going to throw a few questions in sort of one bundle. But what are the obstacles that they would need to overcome to have a truly regenerative supply chain, and how close are they to achieving that?
Oh, there's a good question. So I think they are talking about. So at the moment, it's a project on one farm, and they're looking at the question is, how do you scale? How do you scale when you source? McDonald's would be, they make burgers, so they're not using fillet. They're using forequarter and flank, all proper meat and all of that. I must just emphasize, because I know that will be a critic thing. It's all from real animals. But it's the supermarkets take the prime cuts, and the likes of McDonald's and other burger makers, they take the forequarter and flank. And actually, as a nation, it means we balance carcasses very well. It's actually a really efficient model. And so they're taking effectively beef from probably around 17,000 beef farmers. They would be taking parts of those animals, because they're taking them almost from they're buying forequarter and flank from all the good and approved abattoirs in the country. So farm wise, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. So there's a couple of ways. There's a how do you do that? The McDonald's are seeing growth, like for like growth, every quarter consecutively for I can't remember how many years it is now. But we have to understand that as a business they are growing, and therefore their volume is growing. And yeah, so how do they do that? I don't think I have the answer. I guess I'm just highlighting a couple of the challenges that come about. So I guess at the moment it's an exploratory.
Yeah.
We know we need to do more. We have a carbon footprint that we need to try and work out how we're going to offset as a business. And actually agriculture, scope 3 emissions, the agriculture side of emissions, make up the majority of most food businesses' emissions. And so how do we help tackle that? Food from a regenerative system is likely to be part of that solution, and so that's where they're at the exploratory stage at the moment. I think that's the fair to say. But I guess they made a commitment to the AMP project we started it in 2020, so they made the commitment in 2019, and that was everybody now is like regen. That's all you ever hear. But back then it wasn't that so much. So they kind of made a leap of faith early on in this movement, I would say.
Interesting. So for them, really, in terms of transitioning their business, it's like turning a tanker ship around. It's the initial inputs have started, but the momentum is going to take a very long time before the ship actually moves, and that's been achieved. I was at an event last night, which was a sort of debate, veganism versus ethical omnivorism, and I was representing the ethical omnivore, and a lot of people were asking questions about kind of feasibility and scale and things like that, and I found it very interesting that I was being asked the questions of like how can this scale up, and where will that come from? Is it coming from farmers making the change? And I believe that it's going to come not from of course it will come from farmers making the change, but I'm a great believer in industrial change coming from consumer pressure. And I believe that when the public are fully educated and actually understand what regenerative is, that will force the change in the industry, and that will cause brands to start to say to their supply chain, we need regenerative because it's what our customers want. But I also fear that we're about to enter what I call the wild west of regen ag, where the term is used, abused, and greenwashed. What do you think we can do in the coming sort of, say, 3 to 5 years to mitigate the problems of regen being used as a greenwash term without clear definitions? What do we need to do to clarify that so that the public will have faith in it as a concept and standard?
Yeah, okay. I think I agree with most of that, and I think, but the one bit I would just say is I think it is actually uniquely on this occasion, it's something that can only happen from the ground up. So there can be market indicators, and there can be pressure or support or whatever that comes from the food industry, but ultimately nobody can tell someone how to be a regenerative farmer, because it is about listening or observing and reacting to feedback from your own ecosystem as a farmer, which is your farm. So you can't sit in an office in London somewhere and say this is what you must do, and pull up this list of prescriptions, which tends to be, as we act now, our certification schemes. It's great, they keep our food safe, but they are lists of things you're told to do that you have to keep paperwork about. Yeah. They are nothing looks purely at the output of the land. And so I think that I think it will actually come from all angles. More farmers will do it because it makes sense, particularly with the volatility of inputs, not just cost but availability, and the long-term impact that's going to have. Buying grain to feed ruminant animals with the pressures that are coming in the world on food security, it's just going to become a bit of not sensible to do anymore, I feel. And so I think people will switch to it anyway. It will switch to it anyway. And then I think the question we just have to keep asking is, when everybody's talking about regenerative, is and tell me how you look at your land to know it's regenerating. Because lots of like, oh yeah, we use a direct drill, or yes, we cover our slurry store, and now we're using effective microbes in our slurry. They're all really good things. They're all really good tools, but they used in isolation, they don't mean that you are a regenerative farm. Is your land and water cycle regenerating? And the only people that have really coined a way of measuring that so far is Alan Savory and the ecological outcome verification,
EOV,
and
yeah,
EOV, the way of measuring there, because that literally, they, as a farmer, it's the best audit in the world. They come to the farm, they spend 2 days with us, and we go around the whole farm and we look at our land and we see what's happening and we compare it to our notes from last year. And wow, what an experience! There's not a tick box in sight, and that's amazing. So I
right.
think that's the thing. It's that we're just, all we have to do to avoid the greenwashing is just keep asking the question: how do you know your land is regenerating? And then that washes through any other things.
So you always need. I've often said this to people trying to understand what regen is, and I've explained it as outcome based, not prescriptive. But for something to be outcome based and measured, you always need 2 points with a gap of time in between, right? So you need a baseline and then a secondary measurement a year, 3 or 5 years later to actually know that you're regenerating. What the thing that I'm slightly puzzled about is, if regen is purely outcome based, is there the possibility to be conventional and regenerative versus organic and regenerative? And how do you see you could be non-sustainable in your methods and approach, but still get a regenerative outcome? Do you think that's possible? And how can we mitigate against that?
That's a good one. I think to answer the first question, can you be conventional and regenerative? Absolutely. So so often people say, well, organic and regen are the same thing. No, you can be an organic regenerative farm, but just because you're organic doesn't necessarily mean you're regenerative. And I say that from a place of experience. The first thing that made us realize we needed to change something at the farm in Oxford was the soil just looked and felt dead. We were following all the rules that come with being organic certified, but we maybe didn't have the understanding as the full understanding of what regeneration is all about. So I think when Eve Balfour set up the Soil Association, that's where she was coming from. But it's more of a, not just about organic standard, it's a permaculture way of thinking. It's bringing design into farm. It's teaching ourselves eco-literacy again. So when I look down at the soil, or when I look down at my land, can I see signs that water is running off the top, or is it all percolating in, for example? That would be an indication it's regenerating. And if it's not doing those things, if water's sitting on top, there's more to be done. That was the first question. And there was another one about, will we get to this point of getting regenerative outcomes? I don't think, with all things in balance, I don't think you'll get regenerative outcomes if we use Savory's EOV score. That score won't continue to improve or see good outcomes if other things that are happening in the system aren't in balance.
Okay, interesting. So eventually you would lose the benefits of having external inputs from being able to say that you're regenerating, because there's a conflict there of, like, if you're bringing in feed, fertilizer, herbicides, insecticides, that eventually is going to prevent the regeneration. Is that kind of what you mean? Okay.
Yeah. If you're using all of those things on your land, you won't see signs of regeneration. You'll see signs of degeneration.
Yeah, so it's almost like the system looks after itself in terms of the certification is all about the results.
Yeah.
You mentioned the obviously the EOV system, but there are a number of other marks which we've come across for regeneration. There's Regenuary, there's a Greener World, there's Leaf. Do you know much about all these other certifications and how they operate in terms of, because I do think this, I personally think Savory has a difficult time explaining what they do to the layperson. I think quite often once you start to try and get your head into holistic management, it's like talking in Finnish riddles. It suddenly becomes very esoteric quite quickly. And I do think there is a need for a simplification in terms of how we message that to the public over how people are trying to explain holistic management to me. And I've looked briefly at Greener World, Leaf, and Regenuary. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how we can start to explain to the public the pros and cons, or if there are any cons, but just what regeneration, what regenerative agriculture actually is. I find it quite difficult.
So the other certification schemes, yes, I haven't looked. I've been kind of keeping a loose eye on all of them, so I can't speak from where I know they definitely are now. But for example, with Regenuary, it's still coming from a place of input. You know, it's a set of questions that you fill in about what you've been using. It's input based, which is not necessarily, it's not a bad thing. It's a necessary part of transition, I think. It's just important that we bring in the outcomes, and that's the same across the board, not just regenerative agriculture, animal welfare, antibiotic use. It's about, you know, it's about outcomes. We've gone down this prescriptive list with lots of things we do, and we're having the challenges that we're having. So we need to change the way we do things. We can't fix our problems with the same mindset that created them. So we need to think differently. Greener World, as I understand it, is and it would be the way that we work with some projects that we're doing at the moment, pilot projects. It's based on this a bit more of a unique plan. So your auditor comes each year, you write a plan about what you're going to do, and they come back next year and review how that how that worked, and and then they make a judgment on whether that is that it's going in the right direction. And I think this stuff isn't easy, unfortunately. Nature is complex, and we have to start to learn how to understand the complexity of nature again in order to work with it. Because when we take things in singularity, again, this is where we're at. We've wanted to work in silos because it's simple, and actually nature just works its way around us. So we want to just use fertilizer or just use pesticides and put them on at the certain leaf stages of a certain crop each year. But now it's all not working, So, but I do recognise it, and I was the same myself. I talk all these words now, but 3 years ago, I was like, my answer to it all was, I'm going to bring I just stop using those words. I don't understand what they mean. We need to bring different language to it. But as time's gone on, I found that actually the different language is needed because this is a different way of doing things. And if we try to fit it into old language, then that's where your waters get muddied. That's where potentially greenwashing is coming. It is about defining it as a different one, different system. Although I totally get that it is a transitional thing, and what we need to do is find where everybody's, where are they on the journey? What's the bit that gets them going? For some farmers, it's the water holding capacity. For some farmers, it's the fact they see the wildlife coming back. There's different angles into it for everybody. So there is no kind of like one hook, and therefore the explanation kind of goes along with that.
Yeah, I guess I was meaning less from the farmer side and more from the angle of the public, and if we had a product recently which was a co-branded product. We supplied regeneratively certified through Regenuary, regeneratively certified beef to a company making ready meal lasagnas, and it went into Ocado. And I believe this is the first time that certified regenerative food produce has gone into a British supermarket. It's something we're incredibly proud of. But I'm just trying to kind of get my head around how much even the sort of eco-conscious savvy shopper is where they're at in terms of sort of understanding the term, and how long it will be before people start shopping regeneratively. Because I come from a background of being a commercial photographer. I was working for advertising and magazines for 20 years, and so I'm a great believer in change coming through consumer behavior, and that that when we say ground up, I mean, you and I might have different meanings to that, but that I mean by ground up is changing what the consumers are asking for and then seeing that trickle through. And I guess I'm still trying to understand how to communicate that to the shopper, and how to give them the faith in that. But yeah, that's more of a sort of a thought. But I think we've covered off some really interesting ideas about what's happening and the scalability. But where do you FIA what's happening? What's the sort of next 5 years look like for you guys?
I'm going to answer that one in a minute, and I'm just going to come back to your question about consumers. I think part of it is the fact that we refer to them as consumers. They are people that do things, whereas actually, I don't know if you're familiar with the work that the Food Ethics Council have done on food citizenship. So there's a shift in the way that citizens, if we shift the way we think about the people that are ultimately consuming or eating the food at the end of at the end of the whole process that we've put it through, as in the food industry, then it brings more engagement. So there's some really interesting work that shows that when people think of themselves as food citizens, they realize that they're participating in part of something, and that when they make a purchase, they make an action. It's that whole thing about, you're using your purse to influence. But when we just talk about the consumer does this, the housewife buys that, it's totally separating them. And why would they want to engage when we refer to them, to people like that? So what I would say is, I think the key to unlocking that is to work on the citizen mindset through the food industry, and then to start to work with citizens on re-engaging with the supply chain, but using that citizen mindset rather than the kind of traditional method of, we're British, so our meat is best, and now it's, we're regenerative, so our meat is best, because that's just like, it's a million, I've heard that a million times. It's like the boy that cried wolf. So citizen mindset, I think, and the Food Ethics Council and their work on that.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to research that.
Unlocking that. And where do we see the next 5 years? That's a really good question. Where do we see?
So how far away do you think we are from having as much regenerative produce in supermarkets as we do currently, say, organic? Or can you see a point where there is an Ocado range or even a Tesco range of regenerative foods? And do you think that's near future, or is that far future?
That's a good question. So I think that we'll definitely see it in the future. I think that because I think we really would review regen ultimately as the new conventional. It needs to be the new norm, doesn't it? If we're to see the change that we need, it needs to be the new normal.
Yeah.
It's not an added value thing. I mean, it will be initially, because it'll have to be in order for these things to work, because we don't have the scale, etc. So that would be where we'd see it going. And I guess the pace of it will possibly be dictated by the pace of change we're seeing in the world, which is ever increasing. So a lot of companies have made commitments around 2030. They made them a few years ago. 2030 seemed like it was a way away, and 2030 is incredibly fast approaching. Breeding decisions being made now will be affecting the stuff on the shelf in 2030. So it's not very long in farming terms. So I think that as we approach 2030, we'll see a lot more, unless monkeypox and everything else takes over and we see bigger changes. But yeah, I think that is focusing everybody's mind at the moment. Of course, part of the problem is we don't have the volume of products. So if I wanted to be a regenerative shopper right now, I've got to work really hard to do that. And so there's also this piece of, in order to fast track that, there needs to be support from food businesses to help farmers make the transition, and whatever that looks like, whether it's money for capital infrastructure to change over to a regenerative grazing from set stock, for example, or most importantly, it's the learning. So often we want there to be a piece of tech or a thing. We do one thing, we buy all our farmers a thing, and it will solve the problem. What we need to do is everybody needs to have their own light bulb moment, and there'll be different ways of creating that. Now, tech is part of it, but it's not the first thing. All of us need to understand what our farm, how it's operating as an ecosystem, and how it can produce the best food and biodiversity from that area. And then we bring in the tech to support that. And so the best thing that needs to be is investment in regenerative transition at ground level, because as we know, farmers are under pressure, particularly at the moment with rising input costs. How do you make that change to get off that treadmill and have some money and have some faith to do it differently? There needs to be support, and that needs to be through training, if nothing else, just to help people understand how to do it differently and have the coaching that they need to not only go on a training course and go, oh, that was interesting, yes, I'll take that home, but because this is a different way of it's a system shift, it's not just tweaking a few things. There needs to be this ongoing support, because otherwise when things start to not work or you're unsure of what to do when you get back home, inevitably you revert back to the old, because to keep pushing in the face of difficulty when you're unsure is hard. So there needs to be a kind of remodel of the way we support farmers through it as well.
That's amazing. That was absolutely incredible to hear that described. And I think you mentioned a sort of a light bulb moment there that people need to have. And me coming from a very non-agricultural background, sort of got accidentally pulled into this business just to make a film for our first crowdfunding and ended up becoming a co-founder. I had a bit of a light bulb moment when I visited one of the farms that was converting conventional arable into pasture, and I saw the difference in soil and biodiversity on two sides of the same 8-foot track in the middle, and looked like completely different land. And of course, it was just the use. And that, to me, I had that spark, that light bulb moment of, this is reductionist, this is holist, and it was just that tiny shift in mindset of, like, in one field you're trying to reduce biodiversity because you only want one thing to grow. In this field, you're trying to increase biodiversity because it makes everything grow better. And it was such a small, tiny understanding that helped me get my head around all of this. But had I not had that, I think I'd still be struggling a lot more. So, and I think one of the questions I got asked last night at this debate was, there was myself versus a vegan Michelin-starred chef, and we were debating out. Somebody asked the question, what needs to happen to make people make changes for the better as a buyer or consumer of food or a food citizen? And it was interesting how we both answered the question very differently. The vegan chef said, get yourself on social media and get educated. And my reply was a bit more, get some dirt under your fingernails and see the difference. Because I think people need to experience agriculture. People need to see and feel and taste and see the difference in temperature between a wheat field ready for harvest and a lovely lush pasture that's in the middle of the summer, and have those light bulb moments themselves. But yeah, Claire, this has been fascinating. I've picked out loads of sound bites from things you said in my mind to help us along with this. But yeah, I think we've got to 53 minutes. It's been quite an engaging talk. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about that you guys are up to, or what you think people can do who are genuinely interested to find out more?
Well, I think you've just summarised it there. It's that dirt under your fingernails thing, but it's disconnection. Everything in so many areas of life we've become disconnected, and it's about finding those reconnections, and how to do that. Whether it's just reading a little bit more about the food that you're buying, or trying to seek out one special product from time to time, or just learning a bit about regenerative agriculture, listening to some podcasts and starting to understand it. We've all kind of say that we've learned via YouTube, because there's no kind of definitive way of doing it, but there are some great books out there. So and of course buying meat from Ethical Butcher and others, but even if only occasionally, is a step in the right direction. So we've just got to find our own. Each of us have got to find our own connection, whether we're a farmer or a food citizen. We have to kind of try and figure out how to reconnect in some way. Absolutely. And will we see you at Groundswell this year? Yes, definitely a Groundswell. Okay, we're there. We're collaborating with Honest Burger. You mentioned way back about 45 minutes ago the carcass balance issue. So we're starting up a collaboration with Honest Burger to balance their carcasses. So we get the primals and roastings, and they're starting to source as a pilot scheme from Regenerative. So we'll be there. Please come and say hi. Will do, definitely. And thank you for your time. Brilliant. Thanks, Glenn. Thank you very much.